All right, welcome everybody to the Laudato Si in the US conference. My name is Diana Marin. I'm the Young Adult Mobilization Program Manager at Catholic Climate Covenant, and I'll be moderating today's session. We need to share some important information for Spanish language attendees. So 1 second as we share some more information about interpretation. Si está escuchando o participando en este evento en Zoom, puede hacer, empezar interpretación haciendo clic en el botón al fondo de la pantalla, el botón de interpretación, y puede escoger el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Si está participando en este evento a través de la transmisión en vivo en YouTube, no tendrá acceso a la interpretación simultánea en español. Incluiremos la grabación de la interpretación en español con el correo electrónico que mandaremos en los próximos días. Si necesitan más ayuda, manden un mensaje a la caja que dice questions, preguntas. Y si están en YouTube, pueden mandar un mensaje a info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. And before we formally begin our session, I have some housekeeping information. So this session will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered within the next 24 to 48 hours. If you are on the Zoom platform, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching on the live stream on the Covenant's YouTube channel, please email your questions to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. And with that, we will begin with a prayer. Oh, here's a little bit more information. And also please note, the Zoom chat is not available this session. So we'll put ourselves into a posture of prayer. This is a prayer for the life of the world, originally by the Dominican Sisters of Springfield, and slightly modified. Holy Mystery, ever ancient, ever new, we come before you, aware of our interconnectedness in the cosmos, and in solidarity with the rostros concretos of the marginalized. We come with deep gratitude for our common call. Draw us into communion with you and all creation, living with intentional awareness and openness to change. We seek to expand the expression of our lives, inviting others to walk with us in growing solidarity. Free our hearts to recognize and attend to Christ in hidden and unexpected places. We renounce our participation in the sin of racism and reject the societal barriers created by the misuse of power. Through our contemplation, transform us to listen deeply to one another and to the brokenness of the world. Bless our efforts to be the holy preaching. Christ, you are expansive. We journey in that truth, offering our testimonio de vida. So welcome again to the Laudato Si and the US conference. This biennial conference series is co-sponsored by Creighton University and Catholic Climate Covenant to equip and inspire Catholics to more deeply integrate Laudato Si and its care of creation teachings in the US Church. In the last of the 3-part series, we'll focus on the 7 goals of the Laudato Si Action Platform. Tonight, we will focus on the goal of the response to the cry of the poor. The response to the cry of the poor is everyone's cry because, as Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, of the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet, the common home we all share. Catholic Climate Covenant is coordinating the Laudato Si Action Platform in the US Catholic Church through its God's Planet initiative, and Creighton University is a platform signatory. I encourage you all to visit the Laudato Si Action Platform website. It's Laudato Si Action Platform.org to learn more about the goals and where you can enroll to take concrete action for our common home. We have tonight Dr. Daniel Castillo, Ector Olivares, Barbara Johnson, and Beth Gutzler here with us. Dr. Castillo will frame the theological underpinnings of the response to the cry of the poor. Ector, Barbara, and Beth will provide insights to this goal's practical application. Following each speaker, we will have a brief Q&A. And again, you can place your questions and answer your questions into the Q&A box. Now to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Daniel Castillo is Associate Professor of Theology at Loyola University, Maryland. Dr. Castillo teaches and researches in eco-theology, environmental ethics, and liberation theology. He is the author of an ecological theology of liberation, salvation, and political ecology, which came out in 2019, and which features a foreword by Gustavo Gutierrez. This book also earned the College Theology Society's Best Book Award in 2020. His forthcoming book is titled Confronting the Age of Cain, Christian Faith in the Anthropocene. Castillo earned his PhD in theology at the University of Notre Dame. Without further ado, we'll bring to the stage, to the virtual platform, Dr. Castillo.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. Give me 1 second as I pull up a small slide show. Okay. Thank you all for being here. In my brief time with you tonight, I've been asked to examine the theological foundations for hearing and responding to the cry of the poor, specifically reflecting upon how these foundations are articulated in Laudato Si. Another way to frame my remarks is this. I'm going to consider and expand upon how Laudato Si understands the relationship between faith in God and the call to love one's neighbor, particularly to love those neighbors who are forced to bear the weight of the violence of injustice and oppression. To think about this relationship, I will draw from and build upon Pope Francis's use of Scripture in his landmark encyclical. However, before entering into this exploration, a couple preliminary comments are in order. The first preliminary comment is a general one. In reflecting upon the cry of the poor, I want to state from the outset that this cry, though distinct, cannot be separated from the cry of the earth. This, in fact, is a central conviction of Laudato Si. To this effect, Francis writes, quote, "Today we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor," end quote. So, as we consider the theological foundations for making a preferential option for the poor, we'll have to do so with an eye to how these foundations might also serve to ground the preferential option for the earth. My second introductory comment relates specifically to my use of Scripture here. In drawing from the Bible, I'm working to develop what might be called a mystical political interpretation of Scripture. I would like us to consider how the symbols, images, narratives, and figures of Scripture might be meditated upon and prayed with in ways that can shape not only our own personal spirituality and identity, but also our ecclesial, social, and political commitments. What I'm suggesting we do is cultivate an analogical imagination, asking how the situation described in Scripture might illuminate our situation today. Okay, having dispensed with those preliminary comments, let's get into the work of theological interpretation of Scripture. In my view, the most profound use of Scripture in Laudato Si is found in Pope Francis's reading of the story of Cain and Abel. There, Francis develops a political ecological understanding of sin and sin's effects. As I'm sure many of you know, the story of Cain and Abel narrates Cain's murder of his younger brother Abel after God finds preference in Abel. Here is what Pope Francis says about this biblical narrative, and it's worth quoting at length here. In the story of Cain and Abel, writes Francis, we see how envy led Cain to commit the ultimate injustice against his brother, which in turn ruptured the relationship between Cain and God and between Cain and the earth from which he was banished. This is seen clearly in the dramatic exchange between God and Cain. God asks, "Where is Abel, your brother?" Cain answers that he does not know, and God persists, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground." Disregard for the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbor, for whose care and custody I am responsible, ruins my relationship with my own self, with others, with God, and with the earth. When all these relationships are neglected, when justice no longer dwells in the land, the Bible tells us that all life is endangered. End quote. So a couple of things to note right off the bat. First, as I just observed, we cannot separate love of neighbor from love of earth. In this passage from Laudato Si, we see that connection expressed in negative terms. The sinful failure to love neighbor is intimately bound up with the sinful failure to love the earth. Second, in view of the contemporary planetary emergency, that is to say, in view of climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the rise of fascism, the enduring violence of white supremacy and economic injustice, just to name a few dimensions of this emergency, the story of Cain and Abel narrates our situation today. Life itself is endangered. The sinful characteristics of Cain permeate the political ecology of our world. Now, I want to unpack the story of Cain and Abel more. However, before doing so, it's essential to observe the theological understanding of the human person that this story builds upon. This understanding is actually found in the second creation account in Genesis, so in Genesis 2. A fundamental theological conviction of that story is that God creates the human person to be in intimate and loving communion with God, neighbor, and earth. In this account, God calls the human person to cultivate and care, or alternatively, to serve and keep the soil and all that comes from the soil in the Garden of Eden. Here, God calls the person to the symbolic vocation of gardener. Embedded in God's call in Genesis 2, then, is a threefold vocation to love. The human person expresses her love of God through responding faithfully to God's call. And since God forms the human and the creatures out of the earth that God calls the human to care for, the human expresses love of neighbor and earth through that same faithful response of serving and caring for the soil and all that comes from the soil. Thus, one finds that the human person's love of God is expressed through the loves of neighbor and earth, with the latter two intrinsically interrelated. The story of the fall in Genesis 3 then narrates the ways in which sin wounds the human person's intimate communion with God, neighbor, and earth, and impairs the person's ability to respond rightly to the symbolic vocation of gardener. The narrative of Cain and Abel, to which I now return, represents an intensification of both the human community's loss of vocation and its experience of alienation. Nonetheless, the story of the siblings begins with a note of hope. Cain, the reader is told, is a cultivator of the soil, while Abel is a keeper of sheep. Thus, the same two verbs that constitute God's call to the human person in Genesis 2, the vocation of gardener, now characterize the praxis of the siblings. Despite the alienating and distortive effects of sin, a new generation of human life continues to inhabit, even if imperfectly, the human vocation. However, this hopeful note is accompanied by other notes of concern. This concern is rooted immediately in the meaning of the names of the siblings. Amongst its many connotations, the name Cain signifies spear and metal worker, suggesting the potential for violence within this figure. The name Abel, in juxtaposition, translates as vapor, nothingness, and worthlessness. The name of the younger sibling, then, connotes something of the identity of what Gustavo Gutierrez terms the non-person, a human person whose society dehumanizes and deems expendable. This connotation is fitting since it is Cain, the firstborn son in a patriarchal, patrilineal society, who would have assumed a socially constructed position of privilege. In accordance with the logic of his culture, status, honor, land, wealth, and blessing all stand to be inherited by Cain. Abel's status relative to Cain was marginal. Within the narrative, the unease conveyed through the names of Cain and Abel proves to be well-founded. When God exercises a preferential option for the poor and marginalized by finding Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's to be pleasing, Cain is unable to control his resentment and rage. With his privileged status undermined, Cain leads his sibling out into a field, and upon the very soil he was meant to serve and cultivate, he murders Abel. To reiterate then, the narrative of Cain and Abel is one that witnesses humanity's spiraling alienation from its vocation. Whereas the call to cultivate and care for the soil and all that comes from the soil was meant to preserve the bonds of intimacy and love between God, neighbor, and earth, the narrative culminates in Cain murdering a sibling, fleeing both the soil and God, even while the soil itself bears witness against Cain's sinful violence. Moreover, Cain's flight actually culminates in his founding of a city, which is to say, a civilization, or a political ecology, a system of political ecology, one that will sustain and extend the distorted logics and desires of the elder sibling. Under the influence of Cain's logics and desires, humanity becomes alienated from God, neighbor, and earth. In this system of political ecology, life itself becomes endangered. There are two more points regarding the story of Cain and Abel that I would highlight here. First, I'd like to reiterate that God, in accepting Abel's gift, makes an option for the poor, for the marginalized. Here, God is raising up the lowly and lowering the exalted. So through this story, we see that the call to respond to the cry of the poor for Christians is rooted in a fundamental claim about who God is and what God desires. Second, it is worth noting a striking symmetry between the narrative in Genesis 4 and the prophet Isaiah's famous vision of peace and salvation in the second chapter of the book of Isaiah. There, the prophet proclaims that on the day of salvation, the nations of the world shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Isaiah then articulates the reversal of the violence wrought by Cain. Recall that Cain, the metal worker, whose name means spear, began the story with the tools of the gardener, presumably with plowshare and pruning hook. However, in his sinful violence, Cain transforms these tools of service and care into weapons of domination. The work of bearing witness to God's saving love, Isaiah tells us, is about repairing the harm done by Cain. It bids us to conform our will to the desires of a God who would hear and respond to the cry of the poor. It bids us to make reparations to those who have been exploited, and to learn to accompany the oppressed in the ongoing struggle for justice. It demands that we work to transform the swords and spears of Cain's civilization into the plowshares and pruning hooks of a civilization of care. Here, it must be emphasized that to study war no more is not simply to work for an end to armed conflict, though it certainly includes that. The task of studying war no more, however, also demands that we face and work to transform the ways in which our world is structured by ongoing racialized and gendered economic warfare. This is the work of the gardener. It is perhaps appropriate then that in the first resurrection account of John, Mary mistakes Jesus for the gardener. As scripture scholar N.T. Wright observes, Mary is making, quote, the right kind of mistake, end quote. Jesus is the gardener, the one who fulfills the human vocation to love, the one in whom we find the preferential option for the poor. So, the call to hear and respond to the cry of the poor is ultimately and rooted in the imitation of Christ. It is at the heart of the life of Christian faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo, for your really powerful presentation and viewing of studying Cain and Abel. I'd like to let participants know if you have questions, you can go ahead and place them in the Q&A box for Dr. Castillo. I have a question for you as we begin this part of the conversation. I'm curious what you would say that scripture can show us about siblinghood in looking at this story, and how do we move, as you say, more into an imitation of Christ in order to respond to the poor? What types of changes, transformation to siblinghood is necessary, and what can we see from scripture about that?
Yeah, so I think the question, that Cain asks of, like, am I my brother's keeper, also bears resonance to the question that, is posed to Jesus of who is my neighbor, right? And Jesus's response also calls to mind the figure of Abel, right? It's the one who's acting as neighbor in the story of the Good Samaritan, is, well, one, a marginalized person himself, respective of Jesus's group. But this person acts as neighbor by caring for the one who's left for dead, who others who would have been more esteemed in again in the culture of Jesus's group uh, move to the other side of the road to observe kind of their religious, rules and regulations. And so there's a certain hard-heartedness tied to that that's revealed. So the work of what does siblinghood call us to? It calls us to, well, in one sense, expand our sense of who our sister, who our brother, who our sibling is. Um, to particularly be attentive to those who might otherwise be demonized or who might be distanced from us for various ways, and to be attentive to the ways in which um, violence structures the world and creates inhumane situations, dehumanizing situations.
Absolutely. A question from the chat from Sister Rose Torres Nolta is about where else can you direct us to your writings on this topic or any articles?
Thank you for your interest. So in addition to the book that was mentioned, An Ecological Theology of Liberation, one other short piece of writing that's available online, which is actually, I think, my favorite piece of writing just because I was able to be creative with it, was something in the Other Journal. And it's a Ignatian meditation on the two standards of Christ, but it's placed into this kind of a political ecological framework. So it's the tree of Christ and the tree of Satan is the title of it. And if you just Google that, you would be able to find it.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm curious about this topic of right relationship and how to also be in right relationship with that more than human world, with the cry of not only the human world, but then also the creation. And curious if you have any thoughts to share about how to be in better relationship with those with creation.
Yes, sure, certainly. I guess I'll say two things. First is most germane to what I've just been speaking on is that when we're thinking about kind of, so I'll just share a story. When of the way I came into my work. And part of it is after I graduated from college some 20 years ago now, I was I became a Jesuit volunteer. And so I was living in St. Louis, but teaching in East St. Louis. And while teaching in East St. Louis, I saw firsthand as all of the factories, industrial factories, kind of surrounded this city, but were privatized. They had their own jurisdiction, so they didn't have to pay taxes to the city of East St. Louis, which is I think 99.5% Black in population and demographics. I saw firsthand on the bodies of my students the effects of environmental racism. And so as we're thinking about and so this is toxins poured into the atmosphere, toxins poured into the soil, toxins poured into the ground. As we're thinking about the cry of the poor, the cry of the oppressed, the realities of the violences of marginalization and oppression that humans experience, we ought to be attentive to the way that violence is also at the same time often expressed through what we're doing to the land and with the land. With regard to the question of the earth itself, I think I will just say this, that the practice of restraint is important and is fallen out of fashion quite a bit in everyday discourse, even in a lot of Christian ethical discourse. But it's certainly present in the ethos of Laudato Si, right? So when Francis is lamenting the effects of a global consumer society, what he's calling for, in a sense, is the practice of restraint to allow the earth to have Sabbath, to allow the earth to have space to exist. And so that practice of restraint also needs, it can be rooted in many different things, but part of what's going to help generate this is Laudato Si starts off with praise be to God, intentionally, right? With Laudato Si intentionally, because Francis is inviting us to praise God for the beauty, the goodness, the wonder of creation. So as we cultivate restraint, also working to cultivate an eye, an attentiveness to that beauty, to that goodness, is part of the work.
Thank you so much for that,
Thank you for the
Dr.
question.
Castillo. We will now move over to the next part of our program, which will be the practical insights that will be offered by Ector Olivares. And thank you again, Dr. Castillo. I'll invite Ector to place yourself on video. There you are. Welcome. I'll give you and to introduce you. One second. Ector Olivares is the manager and of environmental justice program at Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Stockton. This is the only environmental justice program nationwide that is part of a Catholic Charities. He supervises teams that work in San Joaquin County and also Stanislaus County. He also provides the diocese and the bishop with recommendations on environmental issues. Ector served 6 years in the US Army, where he was stationed in Missouri and South Korea. After his service, he attended San Joaquin Delta College, where he received his AA in criminal justice. From there, he attended CSU Sacramento, where he received his BS in criminal justice. He then worked for the San Joaquin County District Attorney's Office as a victim advocate and at the Women's Center Youth and Family Services as a manager of the Safety Net program. And I know today he had a full day advocating and meeting with his representatives. So appreciate you coming on board today, Ector, to share more with us. And I will get your slides in a second, but you can begin.
Sure. Well, that was half my presentation there. So, no, I'm just kidding. But I would like to thank everyone. Again, Ector Olivares, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. Definitely like to thank Catholic Climate Covenant for inviting me back. I presented 2 years ago, and apparently they like what I said, so they invited me back. So thank you again. Just going through the chat, I've noticed, the people from all over the United States, and I think I even seen someone from Australia, right? So that's really incredible. It's really amazing. 356 people right now logged on watching this. So I'm blown away. I'm very impressed. So I'm going to go through my slides. And next slide, please. So where are we? Where are we located? And again, this is there's maybe a few people here from California, but for others that are not familiar with California, San Joaquin County is pretty much centrally located. If you take a look at the map of all the counties, we're right there in the middle, right next to the Delta. And if you try to visualize it, we are just east of San Francisco and just north of Sacramento, which is, of course, the capital, right? And our location, again, is on traditional lands of the Miwok Native Americans. But the Diocese of Stockton also includes Tuolumne County, Stanislaus, Calaveras, Alpine, and Mono counties. So those are the counties that would be just east of us that would border the state of Nevada. So just to give you an idea what the diocese covers. So it covers all the churches in that area, but mainly with our environmental justice program, we have employees, we have advocates that work in San Joaquin County and Stanislaus County. Next slide, please. So initially we started in about 2005, and it started as just volunteers, people that were interested in environmental issues, right? And it was encouraged by our bishop at that time, Stephen Blair, who since passed away, but he was just a big support, a big believer and early believer within the Church of Climate Change, right? In 2015, I think you guys can all know what happened in 2015 with the encyclical from Pope Francis. You know, we started transitioning from just volunteers to actually full-time employees, people dedicating their entire, work hours to addressing climate change within the Central Valley here in California, right? And again, it was based on Pope Francis's call to action to address, to get involved, for everyone to get involved in climate change. And as was mentioned, we are currently the only environmental justice program in all of Catholic Charities across the country. It is a little bit of a badge of honor, but it is something we would definitely like to see changed, because there's so much that we can do, so much that we can get involved in, that us Catholics have such a strong voice, and it's a mandate for us. So we, in the future, we would definitely like to encourage and help and provide any technical support for any other parish, any other diocese that's looking to start their environmental justice program. Next slide, please. All right, so what's our mission? What do we do? And it's a little hard for people that are not really traditionally involved in the environment. And when we look at in Catholic Charities, and I know that a few of you here on the call actually work for a Catholic Charities. Most Catholic Charities are direct services. We have a food bank, we have veteran services, we have family wellness, immigration services, so a lot of direct services. With us here at Catholic Charities, with our environmental justice program, we're the only program that's structured a little bit different. We don't have direct services. We don't meet with clients. We don't hand out things to clients. We don't work directly with clients in that way. We do work with the public. We do work with, legislators. We do work with other organizations, but we don't have that direct service. We hand things off necessarily, right? So our mission, again, is to use our voice to work on air quality, reduce fossil fuel emissions, advocate for sustainable community growth, reduce impacts of climate change here all throughout the Central Valley. And again, it's according with Catholic social teachings, right? And it's particularly what we like to do is we focus our work on the most impacted communities here within the Valley. And unfortunately, it's always communities of color. It's always the disenfranchised communities. It's always the disinvested communities. They're the ones that, even within a city, our poorest communities are the ones that suffer the most. And this is why we see it as so important. Next slide, please. So just give me an example. So I pulled up some maps, and this is from a program called CalEnviroScreen that's maintained by the state of California. And it gives you, breaks down communities into different areas, and it gives you your exposure to pollution, right? Your pollution burden. So this map here on the left, first one is showing a little bit of the Central Valley. And you can see most of the Central Valley is red. And of course, when you're talking about exposure to pollution, red is gonna be bad, obviously. Green, good, right? And most of the Central Valley, which runs pretty much from north to south, is really impacted by higher pollution burdens. And if we take a look at the center box right there, and I've had it a little highlighted, this is Stockton. So this is an area of Stockton that's actually some of the worst air quality within the entire state. And from there, it's within the entire nation, right? When we take a look at it, CalEnviroScreen uses a scoring system from 0 to 100. A 0 being very good and 100 being probably the worst, the highest score you can possibly get. And if you look at their scores, their percentiles in the white box, the bottom white box, their overall pollution burden, they're at a 95. The pollution characteristics percentiles at 100. And their score from CalEnviroScreen is at 100. So that's some of the worst air quality. And what are some of the health effects? Well, take a look at the box above. Asthma. The asthma rates are at 100. Low birth rates, 99. Cardiovascular disease, 89. So pollution itself has a definite correlation with poor health. 1 in 5 children here within the Central Valley suffer from asthma, and that's directly related to poor air quality. So again, our communities that we focus in are the communities that are most impacted. Next slide. So this is how we break down our focus, right? So you have three bubbles. We have community, we have parish, and we have advocacy, right? And I think for us, this really has to go hand in hand. You can't focus just on one because, you know, the parish is part of the community is part of the parish. And advocacy is basically, you know, you're working with legislators, you're working with people in power that enact all these laws, and enact the zoning restrictions, and enact, you know, things that are directly going to affect the community and directly affect the parish. So when you work in the environmental justice field, you have to focus on all three. Next slide. So what is the cry of the poor? Right? What is it? What are they seeking? What do they want? Right? That's a big question. What do they want? What are they seeking? Next slide. It's real simple. It's equity. It's nothing more. It's nothing less. It's nothing more than what healthy communities are having. They want these same opportunities. They want what everyone else in a higher socioeconomic status has. Better housing, you know, health resources, fair land use, a better environment, green spaces, you know, and of course, a better economic opportunities. And that's exactly what we try to work on. That's our key word, is equity. You know, we're not fighting for anything more. We're fighting just to keep them, give them or allow them to really have what everyone else enjoys. And if you think about that last slide, that's exactly not equity at all. When they live in such a highly impacted areas where it affects their health, and you have areas that just miles away that are on a higher socioeconomic scale, they don't have the same types of exposure to pollutants, right? And my next slide. So I'm not going to go in too much about our Catholic mandate. I know Dr. Castillo kind of did a powerful job explaining Laudato Si and how that relates, and the story of Cain and Abel relates to it. So, and again, this is all based on Laudato Si, but you know, even before Laudato Si, our Catholic social teachings, and this is something that, you know, for us is our North Star, is our guiding principle, right? Just some of our Catholic social teachings that we see as why we do this, and why everyone here on the call should get involved in the environment. It's called family community participation, call to participation, everyone to get involved, everyone to get involved in your community, everyone get involved with not just your family, your immediate family, but your societal family, the people that you live with, right? And we have rights and responsibilities that again is part of our Catholic social teachings that shows us that, you know, as Catholics, this is something that we need to do. This is something we need to get involved in. You know, we think about rights and responsibilities of the human life. Oftentimes we think about pro-life issues, right? But what about the lives that are here, that are current, that are now? So it's more than that. It's also the lives that we, you know, that are here now, that are in our communities, the ones that are affected by climate change. And the last one, of course, is the obvious one, which is care for God's creation, right? So we base this a lot on the definition of what environmental justice is, which is equity, you know, fair treatment, equal and meaningful involvement of everyone. Doesn't matter what community you live in, right? To respect to their development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. You know, the same protections from environmental and health hazards that everyone else has, the same enforcements. And of course, the biggest thing is equal access to decision-making, that the ones in the marginalized communities also have a voice, not just the builders, not just the ones that are well connected, that them as community members have an equal voice, right? And that's just kind of something that we see, and we try to get ourselves involved in, especially with community. And my next slide. How do we do this? You think global, you act local. A lot of you guys are already involved in the environment, so that hats off to you and I applaud you. But it's also things that I want to really challenge you to get deeper involved, to really expand. So, first of all, if you are not involved, or you're involved, but you can feel that you can do more, you have to know what's going on in your community. You have to get involved with the nuts and bolts of what goes on in your community. And that's the boring stuff. That's the stuff like the city council meetings. That's the stuff that just sits, that you have to go to, those meetings that are online, the board of commissioners. That's where everything really happens, right? And you have to get yourself involved in why it's so important, because things get passed oftentimes without community input because people aren't involved. And when you're thinking about, this warehouse, why are they building this factory here in this community, and they're spilling emissions? If the factory is already built, it's too late. There's a process where it gets approved. That's the time to really state your concerns and really organize, even before that, the groundwork, right? And the biggest thing, reach out if you want to get involved, if you want to expand your work, reach out to other local environmental groups. You have to work in a coalition. It would really expand your voice, and it really helps amplify your voice if you work in coalitions with other environmental groups. Seek out these other groups, build big coalitions with them. You can't do it alone. With us, there is only a total of 5 of us, right? We can't do a lot of the work that we do without our coalitions. As a matter of fact, we're actually closer to a lot of our environmental justice other coalition members than we are within our own Catholic Charities. We work with them closely. We meet with them more often. We're on Zoom calls more often. We go to events more often. So you have to build that working relationship. And if you're new, if you want to continue your work, get training. Get trained from other groups, expand your knowledge. And once you get that, give training, develop leadership, develop leaders within the community, go out to the community, go out to where they are and start developing leaders, people that want to get involved, right? The biggest thing that we try to do is making sure that community members know how to advocate for themselves, right? We listen to what they want. We listen to what they want to do. We empower them by giving them training, whether it's going to be how to go in front of provide a comment letter, how to provide public comment, how to do power mapping to find out who are your local leaders, and empower them to speak for themselves, because those local voices are much, much more powerful than an environmental organization. Those people that live that reality are going to have a much higher impact. Next slide. And it's just some of the examples something that we do. And I'll give you some pictures right here. This was from last year on our Earth Day. We passed out 150 DIY air purification systems that someone's able to build. We gave them instructions. If you take a look at the top picture, those are students from our local Catholic elementary school. We gave them some training on air quality, and then we use them for labor, to really put together these DIY air filtration systems. And every single student in the school, including staff members, walked home with a DIY air filtration system. And those are community members that lived in that highly impacted area, right? And then not only that, but we teamed up with some people from UC Berkeley to build these. And on Earth Day, we passed out 150 more. Next slide. And we talked about why is it so important to do advocacy work, going to Sacramento, going to your local legislators, and, again, as a coalition, as our Catholic voice, making sure that you speak on policy that is going really empower your communities, that are really going to benefit your communities. So not just locally, but going to your capitals and talking to them about proposals, talking to them about legislation, giving your opinion as an organization. This is what we support. This is what we don't support. That's going to go a long ways too. That's really, you don't have to do it alone. Join a coalition. If you take a look at the picture of me right there, looking nice and fancy in my sports coat, that was with the Power in Nature Coalition. You know, again, didn't do alone, worked with a group, and advocated for better, greener, reliable resources here in California. My next slide. And just an example, the first one is when we sign on. You take a look at the sign on the left-hand side, if you could barely make out our logo, it's right there, right in the center. But look at all the other environmental justice organizations that are part of this, that as a coalition, look how powerful that looks when we send this to legislators. This is what we're asking for. And this is everyone who signed on. That really shows how we're going to amplify our voice. And it has to be with coalition building, right? And then the picture right there is basically us presenting to one of our congregations, talking about environmental justice issues and, training with them to get involved. And our bottom picture is we do have a radio station too. Every other Friday, we are on Catholic Public Radio. Actually, it would be Catholic Radio. And we talk about environmental issues. It's a way to reach audiences all throughout the Central Valley, parts of Mexico, and Central America. And one of our guests was Sister Simone Campbell, if you know her. Nuns on the Bus, was very gracious to come on. And again, very powerful message. And I will leave you with this. Our next slide. If someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. From the Lorax. And I'd like to thank you. And I really appreciate it. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ector. You really drew together what it takes to build a civilization of care, as Dr. Castillo structured for us. And that requires knowing about the issues, it requires organizing, it requires advocacy, it requires building a relationship, and it requires caring, as you mentioned.
Absolutely.
We have a few minutes for Q&A, and I'm just seeing in our Q&A box a lot of curiosity around the groups that you work with. What are some of the community groups? Also, do you work with in the agricultural community? If you could just give us an overview of how that collaboration looks like for you.
Right. So a lot of collaborations are local groups within Stockton, within San Joaquin County, and Stanislaus County. We chair in Stockton, we chair the Healthy Neighborhoods Collaborative, something that we put together. So a lot of different environmental justice groups, including governmental groups. The Council of Governments goes there, and we were able to really talk about the sustainability, talk about environmental issues. And with that coalition, we are able, because we're built up such a strong coalition, we're able to apply for joint grants. So currently right now, we applied for a grant and we received our second round of funding, which was about $25 million. That's not $25 million strictly for us, $25 million altogether for the grant, but that was for the city of Stockton to work specifically in those areas that I showed you that were red, what we call the transformative climates communities. And again, we can't do all the work ourselves. We work in that coalition, which includes Little Manila Rising, Public Health Advocates, I'm kind of blanking out, Edible Schoolyards, of course, the city of Stockton, and Grid Alternatives, which do solar panels on low-income residents. So really, we're part of this. We don't have to do it all, right? We do work a little with farmers, so it is a little bit difficult with some of the farmers, though. But sometimes our views on certain things will kind of clash.
There's a question too around how to get folks involved in advocacy. What's that process like?
Okay, we're looking at residents, It's basically having them going out to where they're at, going out to where the community is at, whether it's going to be something as, something as like an event, a farmer's market, going out and talking to people, going out and figuring out, who the leaders are, going out to, when they have the coffee hour where the parents get together, going out and talking to them, being there at their location. A lot of times you will able to get people that are really interested, right? And you have to give something back. You have to give them some training. Hopefully we have funding that we can provide them stipends to get involved in this work. It's a lot of work. It takes time, especially from the impact communities. There's a lot going on. You have to make rent. You have to, go to your job. You have to take care of your kids. You have to feed your kids, obviously. So there's a whole lot that stressors in their lives, and this would be another one. So it's a way to try to at least give back to the community, to give back to the ones that are involved. But a lot of it is you have to put the work in. You have to go out, leverage your community members. Well, one example is some of the trainings that we were giving, part of our grant deliverables is, we leveraged one of our partnerships with Little Manila Rising when they already had a group of advocates there, of community members. We were able to give that training to those community members. So we didn't really have to go out and knock on doors. We had that already. And that was just a way of us leveraging our partnerships with another organization.
Great. Just a follow-up question. If you could share a little bit more about the challenges that you faced in the agricultural community. What were the differences in opinions or views?
Well, a lot of times the differences are things like pesticide use, water. Water is a big thing. Central Valley of Stockton is pretty much, most of your produce is coming from California, and it's being grown here within the Central Valley, where it's a huge valley, long, flat, very, very fertile soil. So a lot of things are grown, a lot of crops are grown. And 90%, I believe, of all pistachios and almonds are grown here within California. It's a cash crop, right? It's huge money. Most of it's sent overseas, but it's a crop that is what they call mega thirsty. For each walnut that's grown on a tree, it takes about a gallon of water, right? For pistachios, even more. So you're thinking about when we're looking at droughts, it's a competing interest. So we have the farmers, we have nature, which is our wildlife, and then we have our community members for drinking water. And oftentimes they're competing for dwindling resources. So that's when you get a clash. With
that, we will need to move over to our next panelist, but Ector, if you're available, there are some Q&A in the chat for you to respond to as you'd like. But again, thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about what you are doing in the work at the Diocese of Stockton with your environmental justice program. Thank you, Ector.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to welcome to our virtual platform, Barbara Johnson and Beth Gutzler. You can, yes, thank you for joining us on screen. I'll give you both, introduce both of you. So Barbara is a lifelong community leader and justice advocate in her congregation. Her journey started with her parents, one of the thousands who fled the Mississippi Delta in hopes of a safer, better life for their children. The family settled in St. Louis, where she enrolled in Catholic schools and became Catholic. She currently belongs to Our Lady of the Holy Catholic Church in Baden, Missouri. Barbara sits on various committees, including the Environmental Justice Committee, All Things New Committee, Evangelization Committee, North City Deanery Interracial Committee, Racial Harmony Committee of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, Black Catholic Conference Committee of St. Louis, and Catholic Witnesses for Racial Justice. She's also a 20-plus year member of the Metropolitan Congregations United of St. Louis and is a board member of MCU. Barbara has served on the environmental justice team, communication team, money team, and the school to prison pipeline team. She was an early childhood educator and a parent educator for St. Louis City Public Schools, and later for Riverview Garden Schools. She was educated in the Catholic school system from first grade through high school and has an associate in applied science and childcare from the St. Louis Community College at Florissant Valley. Welcome, Barbara. And I'll also introduce Beth. Beth Gutzler serves as the lead environmental justice organizer at Metropolitan Congregations United, that's MCU, in St. Louis, Missouri. MCU puts faith in action by developing leaders who move their congregations, organizations, and communities to change public policy for the common good. Since 2020, Beth has organized persons and communities of faith to address ecological degradation that disproportionately harms the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. Before joining MCU, she co-founded the Social Action and Virtue Education Foundation to share restorative practices with the St. Louis region. Gutzler earned her MBA from Fontbonne University. Welcome, Beth and Barbara. I'll now share your screen and you can begin.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody being here. My voice is a little raspy because I'm fighting these allergies, but it should survive. One of the things that I want to do is to talk about environment in a way where we can expand our knowledge and our vision of what environment is when we talk about environment. And I'm going to start that by giving the definition. Environment is a sum total of all the living and non-living elements and their effects that influence human life. Living elements are animals, plants, forests, fisheries, and birds. Non-living elements include water, land, sunlight, rocks, and air. A healthy environment and health starts where people live, learn, work, and play. Conditions of life are connected to healthy outcomes, especially when it comes to treatment of chronic pain, mental health, and trauma. Social determinants of health are the conditions within a home, family, school, and community that can impact a person's ability to be healthy. That includes the physical characteristics of the neighborhood a person lives in, access to healthy food, safe housing, quality education, and economic well-being. Adverse childhood experience, or ACE for short, are significant social determinants of health that have been linked to an increased risk of mental health issues and substance abuse. Some of the things that affect our environment negatively are air pollution, burning fossil fuels, industrial emission, indoor air pollution, wildfires, open burning of garbage waste, plastic production, coal, oil, and gas. Also, some places without clean water are residents of Jackson, Mississippi, Flint, Michigan, and parts of New York City, Baltimore, and the state of Hawaii have all dealt with contaminant water supply over the years. More than 46 million people in the United States live with either no running water or waste that can be unsafe to drink. The unhoused, HUD, Housing and Development, recently completed their assessment report. It found that nearly 600,000 Americans are unhoused at any night. And that was a report that was put out January 25th, 2023. Also, the hungry. According to the USDA, more than 34 million people, including 9 million children in the United States, are food insecure. There have been this year so far 23 school shootings, 310 mass shootings so far this year, according to the Gun Violence Archive. There are 433.9 million firearms in civilian possession. Healthcare and unsafe births. Too many women in this country have died while pregnant or shortly after giving birth. Black women who, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, face the highest rates of maternal deaths are at particular risk. The failure of medical systems to address institutional racism has made pregnancy deadlier for Black women. When doctors neglect to do a thorough examination in response to their pregnant patients' complaints because of their implicit bias against the patients of color, patients die or suffer serious complications. As a side personal story, the picture that you're seeing, that's my granddaughter in the pink, looking very happy, and her baby bump. She was a few weeks into her first baby, her first pregnancy. Her and her partner were elated, as we were as great grandparents. She did wonderful the first few weeks, and then something changed for her. And she talked to her care team, her doctors. She works at Lexington Medical Center, which is where she was getting her prenatal care. When she started complaining about not feeling this way or that way or as healthy as she was, they dismissed her. They said, well, you'll be okay. It's your first baby. It's your first pregnancy. Don't worry about it. Everything else seems to be okay, without really fully bringing her in for examinations. So as time went on, she did continue to make these calls and make these complaints, and they still just did the same type of rhetoric. You'll be okay, it's your first baby. She even found out later on that one of her calls was not even logged into the system at all. So finally, she followed her instincts and went to the emergency room, and they admitted her immediately. She was fully dilated. Several days after being in the hospital, she delivered my great-grandson, her son, Christopher, who took one breath and he passed. So she is one of those people that's not a statistic. These are real people. These are real people who have these experiences. Also, there have been 7 million people around the world who have died from COVID. 1.1 million of those people have died here in the United States from COVID, according to the World Health Organization. 140,000 children were orphaned by the COVID pandemic and are now living with grandparents or next of kin. 106,699 opioid deaths in 2021. The opioid epidemic has been declared a healthcare crisis. On the other hand, when the crack epidemic devastated the Black communities, we were seen as drug addicts and the use as criminal act, followed by jail or other negatives if you live through that. I guess I want to go back to the definition of environment. All of that which I have talked about is environmental. All of that I have talked about is what people are living through day by day by day. So environment is a sum total of all the living and non-living elements and their effects that influence human life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I'm honored to walk this journey of environmental justice with you here in St. Louis. And I just want everyone to know that the leaders of MCU go way beyond in everything that we do. And I wanted to specifically talk about 3 different ways that action might look like in your communities. So there needs to be some sort of response to the stories that we hear, to all of the concerns that are coming together in our environmental racism here in St. Louis. So MC leaders have done a variety of things, but 3 examples really resonate with what we've heard tonight. The first one is there are concerns with lead in water. So a response to that is actually cleaning up the water. So in coalition with others and our legislature in 2022, Missouri passed the Get the Lead Out bill to put funds to require testing and funds to support immediate remediation for those school districts across the state K through 12 that are having issues with lead. That's the first example of how we took action. As we talked about the connection tonight around healthcare, improving social services as a tool for supporting the poor suffering from different environmental crises is met by Missouri's Medicaid expansion. Many leaders came together to collect signatures to even get this expansion put on the ballot. This was not something that was popular by the current elected officials, and Missourians couldn't wait any longer to make sure that everybody had at least an option for medical care. So that was passed in 2021, I believe, through a ballot initiative process that we have here in the state of Missouri. And most recently, and continuing now in 2023, congregations are actually taking individual actions, from putting healthy gardens so that there's food. It's better for low income and impoverished people at the local food pantries, holding air quality monitors, congregations even canvassing their neighborhoods before local cleanups to talk about illegal dumping and the physical and mental harm that it creates in communities. And I would like to take some of my time to dig into the air quality monitoring work and talk a little bit about what that specific action might look like. So community-based air quality monitoring was a response to not just Laudato Si, but also the Washington University Environmental Racism Report in 2019. These partners came together and requested funding for the Missouri Foundation for Health to start collecting data on particulate matter 2.5 to look at how that's affecting our air quality. So if you see, this was on the next slide, I believe there's the map of all the different congregations that said yes to taking action, that said yes to doing environmental justice work and coming together as leaders to make change. So in the next slide, talk a little bit about what resonated the most when we went into communities and held meetings. This awakening of community leaders to the effects of an unseen toxin, the effects specifically around their health because of the size of this pollution, resonated with them because a lot of them had stories about people they knew who had concerns. Even one talked about witnessing an asthmatic death in their past. So again, I'm using this as an example of what taking action and hearing and responding to the cry of the poor might look like in your community. On the next slide, I want to highlight something that maybe people on the call already know, but I feel like this is the importance of knowing why talking to others about an environmental issue is the first step. A lot of times we all thought that, the fall might be the best time to, be outside and understand, enjoy our nature, But really, that is actually when pollution was the highest for this particular pollutant. And so again, on the next slide, we talked about time of day. A lot of people open their windows at night and they were, oh, I want to save energy and I want to, get fresh air in. Well, when pollution was falling, this is actually sometimes the worst time to open your windows. And these really hands-on personal conversations is what is allowing people to get more engaged in environmental justice concerns. So I want to talk a little bit about just some more things that came out of this study on the next slide. We started to look at particular congregations to see how they might want to take action beyond just organizations like individual congregations. So with this particular site in St. Anne Parish, the city of Normandy, Missouri, if you see on the next slide, the data results were a little bit different for them. They had some peaks. And so in this community listening session, we were able to understand what was going on. We were understand that the flight plats were changing, that they had a carpool lane that wasn't participating in a non-idling campaign, and maybe they could. And then they started to discuss the future and the new demolition that was going to occur next to the congregation in the next few weeks. All of this is the level of engagement that we're all looking for. So here's another diagram that we shared with congregations that was more understandable, more visual than some of the things that typically are seen by our local EPAs and local departments. Something that is really understandable and personalized. So if you see in the upper left-hand corner, that congregation really stuck out. And so understanding what environmental justice issue your community is facing is allowing people to take ownership and to, in turn, hopefully take action. So in summary, the work of our campaign that started in 2020, even through COVID, and ramping up through this air quality monitoring work, allowed for petitions of support, over 500 to be signed just since May of 2022. People are giving their personal statements at our Air Conservation Commission, and all of this work leading to our training organization, Gamaliel, and the beginning of a national strategic priority as of December 2022. These meetings that we held within congregations ranged from the small group at St. Anne, Normandy, to actual community meetings in Carondelet, Missouri. And the work went beyond just the original scope of the grant to encourage more citizen science and connections to social media creation content that could be shared by all different types of generations. So I wanted to highlight this as specific actions on how to respond to the cry of the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth and Barbara, for sharing more context about what you all are doing in St. Louis, and also for sharing and uplifting the personal stories, how these are not just statistics, these are not just things that are happening elsewhere outside. These are also taking place in the US, these are taking place in our communities. These issues are taking place in our families, and uplifting how we can be more aware of that. A question that is resounding in the chat is, what are the steps that we can do to not only be more aware, but respond? Beth, you spoke about the importance of talking about environmental issues. What else can be done?
So yes, there's one thing to present data to a congregation. There's another thing to listen to the community. So having that balance of bringing in the education side of the environmental concerns and how they relate to different health issues and other issues, economic issues, and listening to the stories that you're hearing of the people. That's when you'll really identify what they want to change first.
Mhm. And also, may I add to that, go to your local meetings and find an issue that you're really passionate about, and be open to help in any way that you can. Also, you can make, as Esther said, make contact with your local representatives and make sure they're addressing issues that they campaigned on, even fulfilling those, or find an organization that fits and is committed to and commit yourself to being in that organization, like MCU or whatever organization that's in your community, and then educate yourself. Use the library, read about different issues, go online and Google some, and then do more research in the library, and make phone calls, write letters, join your own congregation in social justice commitments. And if they're not, find another congregation that is doing that type of work. So those are some of the things that people can do. They're not hard steps. They're not big things, but they make a big impact.
Thank you. Another question. What do you wish folks would know about this work, about environmental justice, about the issues that are taking place within the US? What other messages do you have to share for folks?
I'm sorry, Deanna, you kind of cut in and out, so I didn't hear all of that question.
Sure. So what other messages do you have that you think is important for folks to know about these environmental issues?
That is not, I think we think of the marginalized as people who are really poor financially and don't have financial means to lift themselves up, and people who are on public assistance. I think we have a narrow view now of what those people look like. And I think we need to think outside of that, which is what I was trying to encourage with my environmental description of what environment is. It's no longer that. My granddaughter, she's a social worker at the Lexington Center where she works and got her health care. So it's not just people we think are financially insecure. It could be any of us at any time.
And I would just like to say that it's important to understand the structures and the systems that we're currently working in, for us to really understand where the policy change might need to happen and what we need to do to make that successful. So for us to understand, what's influencing and who the decision makers really are, it may not be what you expect. So it's going to be a journey.
A long journey. It's a lifelong journey. Activism that was passed on to me from my mom and my parents, and so on and so forth. We don't get things done overnight, and sometimes the things we succeed at are pulled back. And we got to, start that momentum again. But we can't get discouraged. We have to just know in ourselves that this is a lifelong commitment to be an activist, to be part of making our environment, whatever that looks like, more successful and more equitable for everyone.
Important message. Thank you so much for sharing that, Barbara and Beth, and for encouraging us to redefine what we mean as poor, and how that title is not something that's also limited to just certain folks who have low financial means, that it is something that can be closer to us than maybe we realize. I appreciate that. If I could have all of the panelists show your video so we can give you a virtual applause. Thank you so much for being here tonight on our inaugural second panel on the response to the cry of the poor. my gratitude to you all. I know folks watching virtually are also applauding. So my thanks for your conversation tonight. And with that, we will move over to a closing prayer. Oh, my apologies. This prayer, it will be read in Spanish, and the English translation is to the right. It is from the Conference of Presentation Sisters. Sostenemos la tierra. Sostenemos hermanos y hermanas quienes sufran de tormentas y sequías intensificadas por el cambio climático. Sostenemos todas las especies que sufren. Sostenemos líderes mundial delegados a tomar decisiones por la vida. Rezamos que la red de la vida se puede reparar a través de acciones valientes en limitar la emisión de carbono. Rezamos por acciones correctas en adaptación y mitigación para ayudar a nuestra comunidad mundial que sufre. Rezamos que el amor y sabiduría inspire mis acciones y nuestras acciones como comunidad, para que podamos con integridad mirar a los ojos de los hermanos y hermanas y todos los seres y en verdad digamos, estamos haciendo nuestra parte para cuidar de ellos y el futuro de los niños, para que el amor nos transforme y transforme el mundo para nuevos pasos hacia la vida. Thank you and good evening. And just another note that we will be having 2 other conference sessions next week. We will have the Ecological Economics session on June 27th and Adaptation of Sustainable Lifestyles on June 29th. These sessions will begin at 8 p.m. Eastern at the same time as tonight, and also in the same Zoom link that you used to attend tonight's session. I'll pull up, these are our schedule. We'll be going and having our conference series throughout the next few weeks. I hope to continue to see you at future sessions. And again, thank you to the presenters. Thank you for all who attended tonight.